Welcome to This Month in Mormon Studies, a monthly podcast with the latest news, blog posts, book releases, events related to the field of Mormon studies, a little snark on the side. This podcast is co-sponsored by Kofford Books and the Mormon News Report, and it's co-hosted by Brian Whitney and Brandt Malone. How you doing, Brandt?
I'm good, Brian. How are you doing?
Fantastic. It's good to have you back on. So we have a lot to discuss this month. We're going to get right to it. We're going to be providing links to the topics discussed in our show notes. Let's kick off with the news.
Okay, so one item we missed from last month, Greg Prince was interviewed by Doug Fabrizio on Radio West regarding his biography of Leonard Arrington. A summary of the show states, quote, Arrington was the first professional head of LDS Church history, but his academic rigor and candor didn't sit well with everyone in the hierarchy. Within a decade, he was removed from office, and a number of scholars would eventually face church discipline. Biographer Greg Prince joins Doug to explain how Arrington changed our understanding of Mormonism and how his legacy is felt in LDS scholarship today. A link to the interview can be found in the show notes. As a personal aside, I would also say this one's really, really good. Supplement it with the most recent dialogue podcast that came out, which is Greg Prince's presentation to the Miller Eccles Study Group. That one, I mean, both of those together is going to give you a great primer on Leonard Arrington and Greg's feelings about him.
Yeah, it's great. And of course, Fabrizio is always a great host, great interviewer, asks good penetrating questions. So there's some good information to come out of this. A number of faculty and scholars from around Brigham Young University gathered at the Maxwell Institute's library to begin a new BYU Mormon Studies Conversation Group. Many scholars across campus are interested in doing work in Mormon studies, including teaching, writing, conferences, and other ways. And they want to make stronger connections to support each other's work and to getting to know each other better. The Maxwell Institute's new director, Spencer Fluman, led the first gathering.
You know, I hear stuff like this, and I go, why on earth was I not at BYU during this kind of time? Because, listen, I'm an amateur, but I would have loved this kind of thing.
You missed the window, Brandt.
I know. Getting old sucks. On a more serious note, it is with regret that I announce the passing of Linda Hunter Adams, who passed away July 17th. Linda taught editing professionally, as well as edited more books than could be listed both within the Mormon historical community as well as several books by the general authorities of the church. The most recent book she edited was Thomas F. Rogers' Let Your Hearts and Minds Expand, published by the Neil A. Maxwell Institute. Blair Hodges wrote a very touching tribute to her on the Maxwell Institute blog that we will link to in the show notes, and it's very highly recommended that everyone read it. It's very touching. The
Church History Library has announced an internship position in its Historic Sites Division. The intern will work with the full-time staff on the Historic Sites Division of the Church History Department to research and write historical reports regarding the sacred places of the Restoration. This is a paid internship, which is anticipated to last 1 year. This position is part-time, approximately 28 hours per week. Hourly, non-exempt position. The candidate must be currently enrolled in or graduated from, within the last 12 months, an undergraduate or graduate degree program. Now, this is where I did my internship.
And if I remember, too, from some of our conversations, that was just a marvelous experience for you. You had nothing but good things to say about it. So it's one of those, it sounds like one of those really cool, life-changing experiences if you get a chance to do it.
If I had an opportunity to go back, I would.
Moving on to the blogs, in an article titled, Can Mormon Women Be Witnesses to Priesthood Ordinances, Jana Reese, who I don't know if she writes her titles or her headlines or not, but obviously that's a very good provocative one, commented on a recent Ensign article that discussed Spencer W. Kimball's 1961 visit to New Delhi, where his wife stood as a witness for the baptism of a convert. Jana wrote, I'm glad this story is in the Ensign. It's a step forward for the church's flagship magazine to acknowledge that despite Mormonism's most recent history of not allowing women to serve as official witnesses to priesthood ordinances, for much of LDS history they did, as well as hear the sick, prophesy, speak in tongues, and exhibit spiritual gifts. She concluded, extending the privilege of serving as official witnesses to priesthood ordinances such as blessings, temple sealings, and baptisms would send women the message that the church isn't just talking the talk when it says we are as vital in the administration of the priesthood as men are. This leads back to a theme that I've been seeing as I've been doing some transcription work for a 1980s document, that Mormon history seems to repeat itself over and over, and sometimes it's difficult for us, and this is why I'm glad that Mormon studies is getting more traction. It's difficult for us to remember a lot of these things that have happened because it seems like it does happen over and over and over again. It's a very common thing.
Yeah, this also seems to be on par with some of the items that Nylon McBain recommended in her book, Women at Church, things that women could do and get more actively engaged in and involved in without necessarily changing the theological underpinnings of the church.
Exactly, yep.
Margaret Blair Young wrote a piece titled Race and Mormonism 2016 edition, the less coy version. In it, she wrote, I am disturbed by the upcoming New Testament manual for Mormon youth. This is a sample of what disturbs me. The teacher is asked to divide her students into groups and to discuss the principles behind various church practices. Question 2 and 4 elicit a response justifying the long-abandoned priesthood restriction. She concluded the article with, let talk of past assumptions end. No one should be asked by a Sunday school or seminary teacher to justify the restriction now that we have moved into the full and still challenging implications of its end.
Leading along with that, Aaron Brown wrote a guest post for Rational Faith titled, Does the LDS Church believe the priesthood ban was of divine origin or not? So it leads back to that same justification question regarding the issue of how the historical priesthood ban is being dealt with in the upcoming Scriptural Mastery student book. He wrote, there is no denying that the new manual unambiguously claims that the priesthood and temple ban was of divine origin. The ban fits in the category of policies and practices that can be changed rather than eternal, unchanging laws, of course, but that category is unambiguously described as containing teachings whose author is God. What a mess. In sum, we've now got a gospel topics essay that appears to say one thing, or at least to give interpretation open, and curricular materials that unquestionably say a different thing. Both of these two, I mean, this is going to be something that I'm kind of shocked that we're still talking about this in 2016. I thought we made a big step forward with the gospel topics essays, but at the same time, it's a little, I'll be honest, it's a little disconcerting to see that this is still happening.
Well, and it also shows that the departments aren't necessarily speaking with each other. So you've got the church historical department that put out the gospel topics essay, race and priesthood, and then you've got the curriculum department that's putting out manuals for institute and for seminary. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of crossing over and bringing the unfinished manuscript over to the other side to say, is this historically up to par with what you guys are producing? So unfortunately, it seems like, there are two contradictory ideas out here, but that has a huge impact, particularly given that the gospel topics essays were in part designed to be embedded into our seminary and institute curriculum as a way to help our youth to understand some of these difficult topics. So there's a tension here that is going to have to work itself out.
And I think that disconnect also comes in because you take what Elder Ballard said about 3 to 6 months ago in the devotional for CES employees, where he talked about we have to confront this stuff head on, we have to have the answers for it. But then it seems like we're going this way. So I think that disconnect, it's very alive and well, and I don't know if a lot of people are going to be comfortable with that. But at the same time, I'm glad that you have people like Margaret and like Aaron, two very prominent and very articulate voices that can come out and say, wait a minute, let's see, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing here. We need to bring this up.
Yeah, and a third blogger who's contributed to this topic is Artist Partial, who wrote a piece on her blog, Keep a Pitchin' In, titled A Stealthy Return to Bad Practices of the Past, where she wrote, Latter-day Saints of the late 19th and much of the 20th century were aware of the reality of the priesthood restriction applied to men and women of African descent. There is no evidence that the restriction originated during Joseph Smith's time, and ample evidence that it originated in Brigham Young's time. The only explanations that Brigham Young gave for the restriction were culturally rooted assumptions that black men and women were descendants of Cain, and that his descendants inherited the curse placed upon Cain, and were therefore ineligible for the priesthood. Brigham Young did not claim a modern revelatory origin for this restriction, nor did he appeal to other scriptures for the justification. She continued, there appears to be a stealthy resurgence of the appeal to past dispensations to justify the restriction in this dispensation. This most often takes the form these days of an appeal to the Old Testament. Under the Mosaic law, God restricted the exercise of priesthood to members of the tribe of Levi. This is supposed to be analogous to and explanatory of the priesthood restriction under the Restoration. It is not at all analogous. Restricting priesthood to one narrow part of the faithful is not the same thing as restricting priesthood from one narrow part of the faithful. Artist makes an excellent point here that, and I've heard this justification over and over again, and I'm sure that you have as well, that God worked tribally, that he worked initially in the Old Testament with the tribe of Levi before, potentially opening up the priesthood to the Gentiles. And we do the same thing under the race justification. But I really like that last line that Artist wrote there, that restricting priesthood to one narrow part, that'd be the tribe of Levi, is not the same as restricting it from one narrow part of the faithful, which would be the black members of the church.
Yeah, and here's my last comment on this. If we take an absolutely terrifying trip down Brandt's fantasy world, I would love to see these three pieces, the one by Aaron, the one by Margaret, and the one by Ardis, used almost as Lester Bush's piece was used when it came time to discussing race in the priesthood, not so much in saying this needs to be reexamined, but to take this and say, like, these are legitimate people who are doing legitimate work. We need to take them seriously. I'd love to see that happen, but sadly, I don't know if it is, for quite a few reasons. One of those reasons being they're publishing it on blogs and websites, and sometimes that doesn't carry the same weight.
Sure.
David G. at Juvenile Instructor wrote a piece titled Heavenly Ledgers and Ghostly Specters, 2 recent articles where he discusses Mormonism and media studies, stating Mormonism and media studies, at least from a historical perspective, has been a relatively neglected topic. Recently, however, 2 major academic journals have published articles that engage Mormon history from the perspective of German media theorist Friedrich A. Kittler. The first article is by John Durham Peters, the A. Craig Baird Professor of the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Iowa. It is entitled Recording Beyond the Grave, Joseph Smith's Celestial Bookkeeping, and it appeared in the summer 2016 issue of Critical Inquiry. The second article is by Mason Kamana Allred, a historian and documentary editor with the Joseph Smith Papers and a Berkeley PhD. His essay, Circulating Specters, Mormon Reading Networks, Vision, and Optical Media, appeared in the May 2016 issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion.
Writing about the recent ban in Russia on proselyting by missionaries, Blair Hodges posted it by common consent, "For the church in Russia, sustaining doesn't mean agreeing." He quoted an official church statement that stated, "The church recognizes a new law will take effect in Russia on July 20th, 2016 that will have an impact on missionary work. The church will honor, sustain, and obey the law. Missionaries will remain in Russia and will work within the requirements of these changes. The church will further study and analyze the law and its impact as it goes into effect," and noted that the statement was especially interesting because the church doesn't say it agrees with the law or that it's even a good law. In this way, the church exemplifies the possibility of both sustaining and ostensibly disagreeing with a law. In other words, to sustain doesn't mean to agree with. This has a pretty powerful impact on the way that Mormons view the role of sustaining, and I think that there's, for those of us who tend to lean more on the progressive side, for instance, there's some policies of the church that we may disagree with, but we still want to sustain our church leaders, and I think that this is a good article, not just for the situation in Russia, but for us to understand that even the church understands what it means to sustain without necessarily being in agreement with a law or a policy.
And I think this also begins to develop this case study that we can look at to say, okay, what does this mean? What does sustain mean? How can we approach this for our further discussions when it comes to what does it mean to actually sustain something? I think it's a powerful thing of what's going on. It'll be interesting to monitor and see what happens. Throughout the month of July, by common consent blogger Emily Grover has been writing a series titled Sister Wives of the Traveling Pants, Confronting My Polygamous Ancestry, which right now wins the blog title of the month for me. In her introductory post, she wrote, "For the same reasons that I didn't grow up in the church learning the names and stories of Joseph Smith's plural wives or Brigham Young's plural wives, all of the strong and interesting women of my pioneer heritage were locked up and stored away in a box labeled polygamy on my shelf. Not only did I not learn about these women growing up, I was terrified of them and angry at them, to be honest. I didn't want them to exist." She continued, stating that she will be trying on the pants, as it were, of my great-great-great-grandfather's 11 wives. This is a very intriguing series that is well worth following, especially to see how Emily is going through this emotionally. I think she's a great writer and does a great job of really bearing a lot of her soul when confronting some of these things.
Great series, just super interesting stuff. For fans of the Polygamous Wives Writing Club that came out from Oxford University, I think it was last year, you'll love what Emily's doing here. Joseph Stewart wrote an interesting post at the Juvenile Instructor titled Death and the Historian's Empathy, where he discussed from a historian's perspective the murder of Kathy Sheets, his grandmother's best friend, who was killed on October 15, 1985 by infamous Mormon counterfeiter Mark Hoffman. Writing about his personal connection to the historical victim, he stated, "Empathy is a gift for the historian. However, emotional attachment can skew argument and impede the construction of argument. One must understand without without losing perspective. One must interpret as fairly as possible. A historian must learn to live with joy, heartbreak, anger, and humor of his historical subjects, but press forward and construct arguments independent of how one feels about historical actors.
Well, and this is something that always intrigues me. So no matter how objective you try and be, you're going to be bringing your own biases in as a historian or as a scholar when you're writing about something. And we all recognize that, and you just take that and you move forward. However, I'm reading this, and one of the things that stand out to me is this concept of empathy. I think it swings both sides, because at the same time, it seems like sometimes from a scholarly or historical perspective, specifically from the historical side, you almost want to tap into some of those strong feelings. And while it might not be the most objective way to present the facts, if anything, in my mind, it kind of builds in a little bit of this is how people were feeling at that time. And I'm not sure if you would agree or disagree with that, Brian, but that I think it's a very tough balance to strike between capturing the emotion of what's going on versus objectively writing about what's going on.
Yeah, right. And I think that as far as we can understand what people's feelings were at the time, I think that we should report that. As far as our interpretation of history, that's where our own emotional garbage and junk and baggage can veer in interpretation one way or another. I think that the best historians are the ones that are most aware of the perils of their connection with the historical figure they're studying. It doesn't have to be somebody who's personally connected in your family history, such as what Joseph was writing about, but it can be just any historical figure that you're taking on as a research subject. You become very close to them, just like anybody doing family history work and genealogy. They start becoming close to those that they're finding in their records. Well, same thing with historians. They're becoming really close to those that they study, and perhaps even more so because they're spending so much time digging up as much personal information as they can about that individual, so that they can write a manuscript. Sometimes it's really hard to separate yourself from that historical figure and to not allow yourself to be emotionally driven in your interpretation.
Right.
Let's talk about recent book releases. This month, great Kofford Books released Boudicca, The Mormon Wife, Life Scenes in Utah. This is the second volume in the Mormon Image and Literature series, edited and annotated by Michael Austin and artist Partial. This is the earliest anti-Mormon fiction known. It was originally published in 1855, and Boudicca has become increasingly important to scholars of Mormonism because it gives us a glimpse of the Mormon image and literature immediately after the church's public acknowledgement of plural marriage. And I'll just say, this book, besides being important to historians, is just an awful lot of fun. I refer to it sometimes as the Quinton Tarantino version of 1855 Mormonism, right? I mean, we have, not only do you have polygamy and polyandry being discussed in here, but you have 14 murders, you've got stabbings, you've got hangings, you've got poisonings. I mean, this thing is just all over the place. You've got brains being scattered by shotgun onto ballroom floors during dances. It's really a trashy, terrible novel that it is the epitome of the dime store novel, or later on what became the pulp fiction novel. That's again why I bring in Quentin Tarantino. But it was the pulp fiction of its day. And it really sensationalized and scandalized. It really formed the popular opinion of what Mormons were over in Utah. It made people scared to death of the Mormons out in Utah.
The next one, Apocalypse, reading Revelation 21 and 22, edited by Julie M. Smith at the Neal A. Maxwell Institute, is part of the Proceedings of the Mormon Theology Seminar that the Maxwell Institute publishes. This volume features contributions by Kevin Barney, Julie Smith, Brandy Siegfried, Sean Hopkin, Eric Huntsman, and Adam Miller. I'm to a point now where anything that Julie writes, I'm going to read. I don't have this one yet, but it'll probably be in my Amazon queue by the end of the week.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Hosea Stout, Lawman, Legislator, Mormon Defender by Stephen L. Prince was published by Utah State University Press, and it was released this month. This biography details the Hosea Stout who, although a relatively obscure figure to historians, witnessed and influenced many of the major civil and political events over 50 years in LDS history. This is the first ever biography of Stout, who joined the Mormons in Missouri in 1838 and followed them to Nauvoo, where he rose quickly to become a top leader in the Nauvoo Legion and chief of police. He later became the first Attorney General for the Territory of Utah and was elected to the Utah Territorial Legislature. In 1862, Stout was appointed U.S. Attorney for the Territory of Utah by President Abraham Lincoln. But Stout's history also had its troubled moments. Known as a violent man and aggressive enforcer, he was often at the center of controversy during his days on the police force and was accused of having a connection with a number of the deaths in Nauvoo and Utah. Hosea was a tough dude, and his brother was as well. Both of them were Danites, and they were church leaders, and they were not afraid to pull out their weapons when they needed to. When we think about some of these tough frontier pioneer settlers, Hosea is one of them, and again, he's relatively unknown.
Well, and additionally, I'm also glad to see Utah State getting back into the publishing business, especially because University of Utah has put out so much in the last little bit, and I was kind of waiting for Utah State to jump back in there, so it's really good to see them putting out a solid volume like this.
Yeah, so Utah State is now working in connection with the University of Colorado, and the University of Colorado has a stronger publishing division than Utah State does, so everything that Utah State is doing is going through the University of Colorado, which I think is a good relationship to have. I'm going to just mention real quick in the journals side of things, the Journal of Mormon History released their summer 2016 issue this week. Highlights include 2 lead articles by Ronald Walker, who recently passed away. The first is titled Proud as a Peacock and Ignorant as a Jackass, which may, Brandt, actually compete with Emily Grover's title.
That's a very good one. I would put that as strong number 2.
Let me repeat the title. Proud as a Peacock and Ignorant as a Jackass, William W. Drummond's Unusual Career and the Mormons. And his other article was titled The Titanic War of 1856, A Study of Several Conflicts. Other notable article contributions are by Matthew Groh and Bradley Klein, Garrett Dirkmatt, and John Hatch from Signature Books released an article based on his recent MHA presentation, which re-examined Lorenzo Snow's vision of Jesus Christ in the Salt Lake Temple. It's an excellent article. I highly recommend it.
And interestingly enough, I believe that's how my wife described me: proud as a peacock and ignorant as a jackass.
Yeah,
so,
it's an apt description.
Very, very true. If we look at some of the recent events that have happened, the Richard Bushman colloquium that took place at BYU in June is now available to watch online. Hey, that's great news for people like me. Spencer Fluman, director of the Neil A. Maxwell Institute, who hosted the event, wrote, "The event surpassed my fondest expectations. As you watch and listen, you'll likely agree that the depth and variety of the presentations made for a remarkable gathering. It provided an opportunity for us to celebrate a titan of LDS scholarship, Richard Lyman Bushman. But Richard himself made sure the colloquium pursued a broader agenda. Presenters at the conference included Matthew Groh, Matthew Bowman, Jana Reese, Bob Goldberg, Melissa Inoue, Kate Holbrook, David Holland, Lori Maffley Kipp, Terrell Givens, Phil Barlow, David Hall, Adam Miller, Ann Taves, Armin Mouse, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Claudia Bushman, Richard Bushman, and so much more."
What an amazing lineup, right?
This is like the all-stars of Mormon studies, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it's, if you were to put together a Harlem Globetrotters team of Mormon historians and scholars, I think this would be the Harlem Globetrotters.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Interpreter Foundation has also released a number of video presentations from the 2016 Science and Mormonism Symposium that took place in Orem, Utah. Presentations included Catholic theologian Brother Guy Consolmagno delivering a keynote address titled Astronomy, God, and the Search for Elegance, BYU Professor of Philosophy James E. Falconer's remarks on dualism, Camille Stinson Williams, who spoke of an LDS perspective on the body where she addressed such topics as transgenderism and transhumanism, Samuel Brown, one of my personal favorites, who discussed humans as deity in late modern culture, Ugo Perego, an LDS geneticist whose presentation was titled All Abraham's Children, a Genetic Perspective, Brant Gardner discussed visions and the role of the recipient to translate the visual into language, and Jeffrey M. Bradshaw delivered a paper titled The Future Isn't What It Used to Be. As with most of what Interpreter does, this conference tends to sit on the more conservative side of Mormon thought. For those interested, check out the show notes. We are pleased to have with us Brittany Mangleson to give us a quick recap of some of the sessions at Sunstone that she was able to check out. Now, Brittany is a member of the Salt Lake City community of Christ Church, and she's also the co-host of Project Zion podcast, which is an ecumenical podcast within the Restoration tradition. We'll be linking to that podcast in our show notes. It's a great podcast that I highly recommend for checking out. Now, Brittany, the community of Christ had a table at Sunstone. Was this a Latter-day Seekers outreach?
Yeah, so Latter-day Seekers is kind of our term for maybe investigators would be the equivalent LDS word that we would use. And we have had an influx of interest from the LDS Church into Community of Christ. We realized that Sunstone is a great place to connect with other branches of the Restoration. And so this year we had a booth and we had a giant cutout of Emma Smith and Joseph III. And we had a bunch of materials, and we're just able to talk to people from all flavors of the Restoration, which was a really cool experience.
Well, it's great to have you, Brittany, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my relationship with the Community of Christ, both from a historical perspective and as just a personal perspective. So go ahead and give us some of your impressions on Sunstone this year.
I don't know if this is the year that's had the most diversity, but I felt like there was a lot of diversity. I mean, there were flavors from everybody. I mean, I think there was even a Bickertonite representative there, and we had Community of Christ, and we had tons of different expressions of polygamy. Community of Christ, we were involved in several sessions. I think we had a representative every day doing various sessions, whether it was John Hamer or Bill Russell or whoever. Steve Shields did a really good one as well. I ended up being really fascinated with all of the Mormon fundamentalist sessions. So I went to the one with Winston Blackmore's wives and daughters. I think he had, 2 wives and 3 daughters that were on a panel, and they talked about their family up in Bountiful, up in Canada. And that was fascinating.
I've appreciated the John Whitmer Historical Association with the Community of Christ for the same reasons that you're discussing here, that it brings together different groups from different restoration traditions. Now, it's focused on history. It's a historical association. Mm-hmm. So, naturally everything that's presented is going to be on a historical topic, but I've appreciated the camaraderie that is felt between the different groups that define themselves loosely or tightly underneath the Mormon umbrella. And I sense the same thing as you this year at Sunstone, that there was a great diversity. I had just a fantastic time chatting with Daniel Stone of the Bickertonites, and I believe, and Brandt, you know Daniel.
I do. Yep, he's a Michigander.
Actually, I didn't know this until I talked to Daniel. They're the 3rd largest Latter-day Saint denomination out there, so I think they have about 20,000 members right now.
Of course, I picked up Carolyn Pearson's new book and went to the session on that, where she ended up reading the chapter about Emma Smith and what she would tell Emma when she meets her in the next life. And I was kind of a baby and just cried through the whole thing. And
well, tell us real quick about her new book, because that's actually not one that was on the recent book list, but I know that she did put out a new book.
It connects the dots of Mormon polygamy in the modern day LDS Church. And
so for those who aren't familiar with this, the book is titled The Ghosts of Eternal Polygamy.
Yes.
Great. Brittany, it was great to have you on the show. We really appreciate your time and your insight, and I appreciate what you do with Project Zion Podcast.
Thanks.
And as well as what you do in the local community.
Okay.
Thanks, Brittany.
Talk to you later.
Okay, I'm glad we had Brittany on, since I wasn't able to go, and Brian, I know you were there, but you were kind of stuck behind the booth, so it's good to hear the firsthand experiences, especially because from what I understand after talking to Lindsay Hansen Park, they had just a massive year this year at Sunstone. So I'm glad to hear it was as good on the inside as it looked through social media. Yeah,
over 1,000 attendees, according to Lindsay.
Just nuts. Good for them. Good for them. Also happening at the same time as the Sunstone Symposium was the Wheatley Summer Seminar at BYU. This year's theme was Mormonism and Modernism, and presentations were given on July 29th by James Faulkner, Jason Kerr, Ben Peters, and Brad Kramer, a former employee of Greg Kofford Books and a pretty okay guy.
Yeah, he's pretty okay. BYU also held a New Testament commentary conference on July 29th with the theme New Mormon Ideas About Mark and Hebrews, with presentation by Michael Rhodes, Joshua Matson, Richard Draper, Avram Shannon, Ben Spackman, who's also a blogger with Times and Seasons, and Julie Smith.
As we go forward looking at the upcoming events and calls for paper, the 2016 Fair Mormon Conference is taking place this week, August 4th and 5th, at the Utah Valley Convention Center in Provo. The event was streamed for a cost, and recordings and transcriptions of all the sessions are typically posted by Fair Mormon. This year's speakers include Royal Skousen, Matthew Groh, Matt Roper, Wendy Ulrich, Jill Durr, Allie Isom, Catherine Church, Grant Hardy, Patrick Mason, Ralph Hancock, Brian Stubbs, and Daniel Peterson. And I can tell you that there's probably going to be at least 3 or 4 of those that I'm going to be watching and probably streaming on my way to work in the morning.
The Mormon History Association has announced its call for papers for their 2017 conference, which will be taking place in St. Louis, Missouri. The theme of the next conference will be Crossing and Dwelling in Mormon History, borrows concepts from religious studies scholar Thomas A. Tweed, who argues that religion is simultaneously in motion and in place. The theme seeks to capture both St. Louis's general history and Latter-day Saints' connections to the city's past.
The Society for Mormon Philosophy and Theology will hold its 2016 annual meeting on October 13th through 15th at BYU with the theme Christ Our Forerunner. We'll link to the call for papers for this event. And finally, the John Whitmer Historical Association will be having their 44th annual conference at the Kirtland Temple's Visitor Center, September 22nd through the 25th. If you go to jwha.org, the John Whitmer Historical Association website, you can find more details there. Personally, I'm going to try and make it down. We don't get many Mormon conferences in my area, and it's only 3 hours away. So if you are going to JWHA, say hi to me and tell me some bad jokes.
They're going to be bringing in a Restoration Studies Association that was broader in that it also had the Disciples of Christ and other groups that emerge out of the Campbellite movement. Well, that's kind of being brought over now into John Whitmer Historical Association. So this is going to be their first joint meeting that they've had together. And I expect really, really, really cool things that discuss the broader Restoration movement and Mormonism's role within it. I'm envious of anybody who gets to go out there. I'm not going to be able to be out there this year. I'm actually presenting at another symposium at BYU at the same time for publishers, but man, if I could be out there, I would. And that wraps us up for this month in Mormon Studies. You can subscribe to this podcast through the Kofford Books AuthorCast on iTunes, Google Play, or any other podcast feed that you fancy. I'd like to thank my co-host, Brandt Malone.
You got it. Thanks for having me on.
And also our guest, Brittany Mangleson. Brandt, we'll see you next month.
You got it. We'll talk to you then.
So you set the bar. You never told me how far. What you expect is high.